Hey guys, welcome to your very first video for this school year. I know we watched a video yesterday, but that was more just getting you used to Edpuzzle. This is going to be our very first video pertaining to the information we're going to start with for the school year. So I know that this seems really strange and it's a very new concept. So I'm going to take this video pretty slow as we progress through the year. You'll see that I'll probably move a little faster. A lot of times I speak really fast, so you may want to pause the videos so you have time to write notes or ask me questions at the end of the videos if you just don't understand what I'm saying. All right, so for every one of my videos, I always include an objective slide. This is just to show you what you should know by the end of the video. So this is everything we're going to cover within the video. So if you were to finish the video and then come back, you should be able to recall all of this information and be able to talk about it a little bit. So we have 5 objectives for this specific video. We're going to identify the goal of science, describe how scientists study the natural world, explain how and why scientists do experiments, describe types of scientific investigations, and explain what a scientific theory is. So a lot of this sounds like a review, I'm sure, and it is. It's all on the scientific method. So you're going to probably be a little bit more knowledgeable in this area. All right, so we're going to start off with the goal of science. And so I know we've probably already talked about how you should set up your notebook. Here is kind of how in my notes, or I guess the PowerPoints that I make, they are a good way and they're set up in a good way that will hopefully keep your notes organized. So I'm going to kind of walk you through how you should write your notes. So every slide, I have a title slide. And so that's what I'm pointing at here. I have a title. So the title for this slide is the goal of science. And so that should be like the head portion that you write down. And we're going to walk through this together. So please don't worry if you're confused by what I'm saying. So the goal of science, that's what we will talk about in this slide. And then these notes here, those notes are just the minor information that pertains to the overall goal of science. So the goal of science is to understand the natural world. That is the major goal. So that is the goal. And there are many ways to go about that because the natural world is made up of things so small as atoms to things as large as an ecosystem or a biome. So to understand the natural world is a huge goal. It's a huge undertaking. So it has to be done in so many ways. And in order to do this, scientists make assumptions. And there are 4 assumptions. These are the assumptions I was talking about. So I'll write that here. Assumptions. I can't spell very well. All right, so assumptions. And the 4 are: nature can be understood through systematic study. So some organizational way of studying, that's how nature can be understood. Scientific ideas are open to revision. So scientific ideas can change. Sound scientific ideas withstand the test of time. And science cannot provide answers to all questions. And I'm going to go through each one of these in detail in the next couple slides. So please leave some space in between each one of these assumptions. So maybe like write nature can be understood through systematic study and leave a couple lines and then write the next assumption. All right, continuing on with the goals of science, let's talk about the first 2 assumptions. So the first assumption, nature can be understood. Nature is viewed as a single system controlled by natural laws. And so last year you probably learned about some natural laws. A good one that I always generally talk about is the law of gravity, right? You drop something on the floor, it's going to drop on the floor and not float up, right? Just based off of gravity that's holding us down. That is a law. There are other laws, Newton's 3 laws of motion, right? An object at rest will stay at rest unless acted upon by an outside force, and the same goes for an object in motion. And there are many outside forces that affect us. So those are laws, and so that's how nature is kind of like kept at grounds. It's basically a system that is controlled by these laws. So these laws are concrete. Laws of nature are expressed as a scientific law, just like I said. Scientific law is a statement that describes what always happens under certain conditions in nature. So like I just explained, the law of gravity. So if you're sitting under a tree and let's say you shake the tree and an apple falls, the gravity was acting upon that apple. Scientific ideas can change. Now here, I just talked about scientific laws. Here is where science kind of gets a little weird because there are ideas that can change. And so whenever it's an idea that can change, it's known as a theory if it has enough evidence to back it up. So these are existing ideas and they are always challenged and they can be replaced. Many times these ideas are not replaced, they're more revised. And so the example I gave you is Einstein's theory of relativity, but there are plenty of theories out there that get tested every single day. Another good example would be like the atomic theory. So the idea that everything is made up of atoms. And we know this to be true, but the theory that was proposed 200 years ago is definitely not the same theory that is proposed now, just based off of the technology we have. So these theories are constantly, they are respected and they are assumed to be true, but there's no way to actually prove that they're true. So they are, that's what makes them a theory. And we're going to talk about theory in a little more detail here in a little bit. The most important point here is that scientific ideas can always change. They can always be revised. They can always be improved on. So the final two assumptions, scientific knowledge can withstand the test of time. So this is just basically saying that a theory, even though it is a theory and there's no way you can prove it, it can withstand so much criticism, it can withstand so much testing, and it still holds its value. And so I already talked about the atomic theory, but it's just that. So Democritus introduces the idea that everything is made up of an atom. He even comes up with the word atomos, meaning small, tiny ball, small, tiny sphere. And then 2,000 years later, you have a guy named John Dalton who figures out this idea and then expands on that idea. And then from John Dalton, you have a series of other characters that played into the atomic theory. And so it would stand the test of time. So within that 2,000 years, you still have the concept that everything is made up of an atom. So it withstood the test of time. Science cannot answer all questions. And so I am not here to tell you what to believe. All I am here to do is give you information about science. And so anything that has evidence and logic and is based off observations and measurements is what we will deal with in class. We will not talk about anything that cannot be explained. So any kind of religious beliefs or any kind of like supernatural things we won't discuss. It will just be based off of evidence and logic. So an observation is anything that is detected either through human senses or with instruments and measuring devices. So if you can see it, if you can take the temperature of something, if you can measure it, those are the types of things we'll be talking about in science. All right, so let's start talking about the stuff you already know. The scientific method. You've probably been talking about the scientific method at the beginning of every school year since the beginning of your science career. So I do apologize that we are hitting it again, but it's really important to talk about because we will be using the scientific method in class all the time. So the scientific method is basically just a series of steps followed in any scientific investigation. So down here, you see all of these pretty little guys. We are going to spend a little bit of time talking about each one. But you do need to know what a scientific investigation is, and I'm sure you probably can assume what that is. It's a plan for asking questions and testing possible answers. So you just create a plan, and if you have a question, you just figure out how you can answer it. And so the first portion of the scientific method is making an observation. You make observations every single day. I make an observation, and I ask myself, why is my 3-year-old crying? So I've already made an observation. Jace is crying. Then I ask myself, why is he crying? I form a hypothesis. So forming a hypothesis is kind of an idea that you're going to test. Jace is crying because I took a toy away. Okay, so I form a hypothesis. I then test my hypothesis. So if I took the toy away, what if I gave Jace the toy back? Testing that hypothesis. I gave Jace the toy back. And what happens? And Jace stops crying. So boom, I drew a conclusion. Jace is crying because he wants his toy back. I then communicate the results to my mom group. Hey guys, guess what? Jace decided to cry for 30 minutes because he didn't have a toy. So obviously the example that I just gave you is probably not it's not done in a lab or anything. But what I'm saying is you can do the scientific method anywhere and everywhere. For our class, we're going to do it just in the lab just for safety. But you're always making observations and you're always asking questions and you're always communicating whatever you find. So this is just a good way to really have a plan set. It's just a nice way to plan out your investigation. All right, so one of the most important components of a scientific investigation is the experimental portion. So, an experiment is a special type of scientific investigation that is performed under controlled conditions, and this is usually done in a lab. Not saying that you can't do experiments outside of the lab, but there are a lot of factors that go into an experiment. The biggest word that I want you to focus on is the word controlled. So everything in an experiment is controlled. And that's really what you need to consider. There are different factors in an experiment. So the main ideas or main factors that you're going to control are the variables. So a variable, there are different types, and these are factors that will affect each other, or one will affect the other. And so there's a variable known as a dependent variable and then a variable known as an independent variable. The dependent variable is the variable that is affected by the other. And the independent variable is the variable that is affected by, or that affects the dependent variable, So the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. So an example of that would be like if we were in a lab and we were trying to determine what stimulates plant growth. So for example, let's say I have 2 plants and I am going to say that fertilizer will help a plant grow taller. So my dependent variable is plant growth, and my independent variable is the use of fertilizer. So one of my plants will not have fertilizer, the other plant will have no fertilizer, and then we will see how tall this grows. If my observations are correct, then I could conclude that fertilizer helps a plant grow. And so it's an experiment. I have controlled all of the factors that will go into this. Now, a big important thing is that you need to make sure that all variables are accounted for and everything in that setting is controlled. So for example, if both plants are in a room, you need to make sure that they have the same exposure to sunlight, because if one is exposed to sunlight and the other is not, then there may be the possibility that your data will be skewed. A good thing also to consider for experiments is sample size and repetition. Sample size would be like if I only tested 2 plants instead of 9 plants or 10 plants or anything. And then repetition would be if I only did this experiment once in comparison to doing it every 2 months at the same time of the month. So those are a few things to consider. So experiments are good in the sense that they give us data, but they can be very limiting in the fact that you're looking at one set of data. So you can't conclude that sunlight is going to help or not help plant growth, because that's not what you're testing for in this specific experiment. We were looking at fertilizer and plant growth. So that's those are some factors, and we are going to be doing a lot of experiments. So you'll get the hang of determining the dependent variable and the independent variable. And if you did notice, I did get a couple of Snapchats during this one slide, so yay me. So I know I just talked about experiments. There are other types of investigations, and in biology more specifically, we will probably do a few different types of investigations. So one of these is known as natural studies. So it's basically where you go outside and you just observe. The biggest problem with this is that you can't control all factors. So obviously the sun is going to be out during the day. You can't just turn the sun off and try and see how plants will grow without the sun. That's really just not how it works outside. So it's really hard to determine what factors can explain the observations that you've made. You can see plants grow and say, yeah, they are getting their energy from the sun, but it's really, really hard to determine that just based off of being outside. And then there's other types of investigations known as modeling. We will use a lot of models in class. We will make a lot of models in class. And this is basically just a representation of the real world. So for example, in our lab, we have the representation of meiosis in our lab. And so you can just see like a huge blown up cell and what that actually looks like in the different stages. And we'll get to meiosis and mitosis later on in this year. And the final thing we're going to talk about is the idea of scientific theories. So a scientific theory is a broad explanation for events that is widely accepted as true. So theories cannot be proven, but they are an explanation to a phenomenon that is widely accepted. So we talked about the atomic theory earlier in this video. That is a widely accepted theory. The concept that everything is made of atoms has so much support and so much evidence. These explanations are constantly tested. They are constantly revised and added to, but the explanation or the main idea of the theory, it holds true throughout time. A hypothesis must be tested over and over again, and it must be supported by a large amount of evidence. So like I was just saying, a hypothesis is the idea, and then that gets tested, and eventually it'll become a scientific theory. A good example would be like Darwin's theory of evolution, the idea that humans come from a primitive species of apes or of a mammal species. And so that's just basically saying that animals evolve from a primitive species and then continue and through natural selection and through inheritance, species get stronger and only the strong survive. So that's Darwin's theory of evolution. It really is, it's not possible to prove a theory, and so that's why many people have tried to challenge a lot of theories, but they are supported by a substantial amount of evidence and widely accepted throughout the science community. So that is the end of our very first video. I do want to talk about the reading that I've provided for you, so I do follow along with the readings while I do these videos. There are lesson review questions and applicational concepts at the end of every single reading, and I am going to show you guys those in class. I know we're going over this video together, so I will show you these. Those are things that I do not make mandatory, and I don't assign them, but I can tell you that at the very least, 2 or 3 of those questions will be on your test. So essentially, I'm giving you test questions that you can do before the test even starts. And we're gonna go over all of this together. We're gonna run through all of this, so please don't feel overwhelmed. If you have any questions, please ask me in Edpuzzle or ask me in class. Usually at the end of every single one of my slides, I try and put a funny meme, but I've learned that I'm really not that funny, even though I think I'm hilarious. And I apologize if this video has gone over my 15-minute limit. I don't plan on doing that for the remainder of the year, but who knows what could happen. All right, see you later.